This is an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.
Hello, this is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association in New York. And we've been following both the virus, COVID-19, over the last few weeks of webinars and cabin fever. And we've also been tracking the reactions of governments and authorities towards journalists. We're very fortunate. Once we saw the news, we found Ruth Michaelson and got her to come to agree to get on here because Ruth was, as we say back home in Liverpool, given the bum's rush from Egypt for producing inconvenient figures about the virus and its consequences. In fact, the son of the former totalitarian leader of Egypt, Mubarak, said that The Guardian was more dangerous than the virus itself, which is a compliment of sorts, if somewhat exaggerated. And I presume by this he meant you, Ruth, as the sort of virus-S in chief. So what did you do to annoy him quite so much? What was it that you reported that got up his nostrils quite so effectively?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say compliment duly accepted, if that's, if that was the purpose of that remark. I suppose, really what we're talking about here is we're talking about science, right? Like in the end, it's not really about me and my reporting, although I would love to say some very grandiose things about what an incredible journalist I obviously am. Really, at the end of the day, the problem is that I wrote a story in The Guardian which examined the potential disparity between the official numbers of COVID-19 infections in Egypt, currently at 1,450. Back when I published the article, it was, I think, around 127. And the likely number of people who are truly infected. Every country in the world, as we've seen, has a larger number of people who are carrying this virus who are maybe asymptomatic or have mild symptoms, or any other number of reasons why they wouldn't have had a test. And Egypt, the Egyptian authorities took offense to this idea that there could be anybody else who has been infected with this virus, even as there were, at the time that I published that story, 97 foreign tourists who had left Egypt and tested positive once they returned home. That was when Egypt had 3 official cases of COVID-19. I cited some research from some scientists at the University of Toronto who modeled the likely size of the outbreak. Their research put the number of people infected with the coronavirus at the beginning of March at anywhere between roughly 6,000 and 45,000, with a median of 19,310. That number became incredibly controversial. It went everywhere. It was attributed to The Guardian rather than to a piece of science. And the following events turned out to be, again, it was a debate about science. It was a debate about the right to cite epidemiological modeling. And obviously it was, it was not good news what happened to me in any sense, but if, there is a need as journalists everywhere for us to stand up for the right to cite scientific research.
Well, you say it's a battle with science. It strikes me on both sides of the Atlantic and the world, it often seems to be a battle with reality and the politicians rather than science. I mean, they really do not accept that the world is not the way they declare it should be. So they take umbrage. I mean, the Egyptians are sort of, yes, they're a bit more brusque about it, but it is very reminiscent of the type of language that comes from Western capitals sometimes when the figures aren't to their liking, isn't it?
I would agree with that. I mean, I think, some of the things that I heard from Egyptian officials were like, well, why did you cite these scientists? Why didn't you cite different scientists that might have said something that was more favorable to our version of events? And so there is a kind of fundamental misapprehension there, that if you don't like what the science is telling you, you can just pick a reality that is more favorable to your politics. And that is something that, dictatorial rulers around the world have in common, picking the reality that suits them. That's also, unfortunately, something very familiar to people like Donald Trump, even to, dare I say it, supporters of Brexit. So yeah, there is a common thread there in just, ignoring the reality that you don't want to see.
And the way that they broke this to you was somewhat oblique, as though it wasn't quite ashamed about it, but they thought they could short circuit the bureaucratic paperwork, didn't they? Wasn't it a whisper in the air, get on the next plane to the airport, next bus to the airport, or else? Something like that.
Well, the events of them expelling me sort of unfolded over a period of, it was about 4 days in the end. So started with being summoned to a meeting with the head of the State Information Service for what I would term a good shouting, which, he wanted to make clear his feelings.
Let me guess, he said, fake news, you're a bad journalist.
Yeah, I think there was some talk of spreading false news. Lots of discussion of spreading panic was one of the things I was accused of doing. He'd received a lot of text messages with worried people. I don't know who those people are. He didn't show us the text messages, but I was spreading panic. And after that, I was told, if you don't retract the story and if you don't issue a personal apology, there will be consequences. And that message was also issued to me via one of my embassies. I'm a dual national. And so I went home and wrote a story about the meeting and some of the, just saying, okay, the government's responded to our story, here it is. And I sent that to them, and obviously that wasn't enough. And so then they did a sort of strange thing of revoking my press card. And first they did it in a way where I thought that the revocation letter wasn't quite real. It sort of leaked out through strange means. And so I think I then tweeted and said, look, if you want to revoke my press card, just be clear about it. So then they did issue an official letter saying, we're revoking your press card. This is your right to work in the country. We demand that the Guardian issue an apology, etc. And then they called me in again to present me with a beautiful letter in an embossed folder to really make clear that my press card was being revoked. So
unpopular.
Yeah, I mean, I asked, I received. I wanted clarity, I got clarity, and at that point, the person that I normally dealt with to get my press accreditation checked my visa and said, it's valid, okay. And then he said, when will you travel? And I said, I'm not, there's going to be a lockdown. I'm going to stay here and not get coronavirus by traveling. That's the plan. And he said, okay, he called up someone at the visa authority, said your visa is valid. And then the next day I started to the visa authority. We'd like to see your visa, which makes no sense. We know that, other journalists have been called to the same authority to have their visa revoked and to have it demanded that they leave the country. And the airport was closing to all commercial flights less than 24 hours when I got, then I got news via the British embassy saying the security services are asking you to leave. And I realized that sounds rather polite when I say it like this, but this is not polite. This is get out. And by the time I'd managed to talk to the British embassy again the next day, the airport was closing. And so they started to ask the Egyptians and say, look, she understands that she needs to leave, but can she wait until the airport reopens? And we'd like reassurances that you won't arrest her in the meantime. And as you would somewhat expect from the Egyptian authorities, clarity on whether they're going to arrest you or not is not normally part of the discussion because it's designed to make you afraid. And so, I then spoke to the German embassy because as I mentioned, I'm a dual national, and they said, we're going to put you on a plane. And that's what happened. And that took about 4 or 5 days from beginning to end.
So here I mean, you're working for one of the most prestigious newspapers in the world. I write for it myself sometimes, so I say that with some conviction. You've got two of the biggest governments in the world, both professing democracy, freedom of speech. Was there any kickback from any of these organizations, or was it just simply how to get you out of there?
I mean, I think when you have a journalist in that situation, their first priority is making sure that you're not arrested. I know that British officials got on the phone on my behalf. I mean, the thing is that we already saw that there was a British journalist, Beltrue, who works at the Times of London, who was deported from Egypt about 2 years prior to me. And she was literally arrested while out reporting, driven to the airport, and they said, you're getting on the next plane to London. And I know then that, you know, similar British officials of the same stature as dealt with my case were on the phone saying, you can't deport this person, what are you doing? And at the end of the day, the Egyptian security services are the ones who make the decisions, and they don't necessarily respond to diplomatic pressure, because that pressure goes to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the security services say, okay, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is taking the hit. You carry on taking those phone calls from British ministers or German ministers or whoever else. And, you know, job done. This person's getting out of the country. So really, it's a question not just of what happens, you know, in the moment, but afterwards. Are these governments pushing back? Are they pushing back about the deportation of British journalists, of German journalists? Do they bring it up in meetings, not just with, you know, the foreign minister? Do they bring it up in meetings with the Interior Ministry? Do they continue to push for journalists to be accredited to have residency in Egypt, where those things are so incredibly important and involve the security services at every turn? It's a much more complex thing than just what happens, you know, in a moment of crisis to a journalist. It's much more about whether governments are really willing to get involved and defend press freedom consistently when you have foreign journalists in a country, or to step up and defend local journalists, by the way. There are officials who, the British ambassador, I know the Canadian ambassador also did this, visited the offices of Madamas, the last independent local outlet in Egypt. And that was an incredibly symbolic and powerful act. But these things have to keep going. Madamas was raided, and so that's why that was so symbolic. But this has to be a continuous action. It's not about waiting for something bad to happen. It's about continually applying pressure, and so that governments make clear that this is their priority. This is something they care about all the time, not just when journalists are deported.
Of course, it's some small consolation to you that, how should we say, you are not alone in this predicament. Courtney, that all across the world, from Philippines, Russia, China, the US, even listening to some of the press conferences in Washington, the kickback against journalists for telling the truth about this virus has gone viral, you might say.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, what Ruth is describing is not unique. Egypt has certainly led the way on several of the things that we're seeing around the world. I mean, first of all, there are attempts to control and restrict what reporters can report on in terms of statistics. Of course, we're seeing it with the health sector, coronavirus right now, but you know, they also have the same laws restricting reporting on terrorism and official terrorist statistics. So, you know, Egypt is definitely at the forefront of control the information environment. But we saw Iraq suspend the license of Reuters for 3 months because it also reported on statistics of coronavirus infection that did not match official statistics. We've seen, you know, Ethiopia and Venezuela detain journalists who have reported on coronavirus, and we're really seeing around the world this huge blowback against journalists, both foreign journalists and local journalists, who are attempting to report on the virus. We're seeing this in terms of physical attacks, arrests. We're seeing it in terms of the continued use of fake news laws now to expanded to include information about coronavirus that does not match the official version of events or may indeed be incorrect because sometimes those in charge are putting out incorrect information. We're seeing the use of health laws now to include criminalization of false news in health laws. And of course, we're seeing harassment of journalists. We've also seen a couple of governments who have accused journalists of having coronavirus. We've seen public responses against journalists who are perceived to be putting the public at risk because of their coverage. It is a very challenging time for journalists. First of all, because all journalists have to contend with how to do their jobs amid coronavirus and the challenges that poses. And because reporting on coronavirus, there's not a lot of interest by governments that already restrict access to information or don't really respect a free and independent media. There's a lot of reticence to allow independent reporting. You mentioned Mada Masr, they're doing really tremendous, enormously important work because Egypt keeps kicking out foreign correspondents and making it really difficult for foreign correspondents to work there, and are putting tremendous pressure on local journalists. And in some cases, these local journalists are paying with their liberty. So there have been arrests and detentions of journalists, and there are hundreds of journalists in jail around the world. And right now, being in jail could amount to a death sentence for journalists and other political prisoners, because obviously you can't socially distance in jail. There's a lack of sanitary conditions. And in Egypt, which I know because I also used to work there, both as a reporter and a researcher, your family brings you food in prison. So, when family visits are restricted, for those journalists, it means maybe they don't have nourishment, they don't have clean clothing, etc. So the abuses against the press, the attempts to crack down and restrict independent reporting are really, really amazing at how widespread they are and how quickly, government authorities have retaliated against journalists.
We really are in a Pontius Pilate moment. What is truth? It's alleged that the British government statistics are at least 24 hours behind, and that people don't count as casualties until it's been definitely proven that they died from the virus and they've had the tests. In New York, there are reports that people are dying in their homes and they don't get counted at the moment. So, I mean, it's difficult because it causes panic. If you can't rely upon the information around there, then it is almost it's a license to invent fake news, I suppose, from people. So, I mean, one hopes that the authorities see that this is counterproductive.
Well, I think we have to really wonder at that. I don't think we're seeing that. And one of the things that is of great concern is the continued vilification of the press and pillorying of individual journalists who are attempting to gather information and ask officials. And we've seen that here in our own country with President Trump berating journalists for asking legitimate questions. We've seen it in Brazil with President Bolsonaro, in the Philippines with Duterte. So, this is by no means a response that is restricted to authoritarian or autocratic countries. We are seeing it in democracies as well. There are reports in Puerto Rico that they are criminalizing the spread of disinformation or inaccurate information, and with prison time fines.
Surely.
And that's in the US.
Mm. But I mean, Ruth, was there any hints? I mean, the Egyptian Mukhabarat are not known for their intellectual dexterity, but did at any point they think, well, here she is, she's writing about the virus, let's isolate her and say that she's got the virus so she can't see anybody?
Oh, I mean, I don't think that was their line of thinking, to be honest.
I guess they're not known for their dexterity.
I mean, the thing is, ironically, that actually my whole plan before this happened was I was very well prepared. I was very well prepared to go into isolation in my apartment and just be doing what everybody else is doing now and sitting at home and getting on with some work and, not social distancing, and the expulsion meant not only that I was, running all over town in Cairo the week before I left, doing things like going to meetings with officials, some of whom insisted on shaking hands, as a kind of deliberate gesture of showing that, everything's fine. Or, going to a public notary's office so I could hire the services of a lawyer. And then I was getting on a plane and going through 4 different airports. So the expulsion in some ways put my health at risk as well, because what I previously wanted to do was just be in one place, as we are all being advised to do. And that was not something that I could do in the end.
You're feeling okay though?
I've now been through 2 weeks of self-isolation. So I think, I'm hoping that if I had it, which I probably did, given all of the moving around I'd done, it was mild. So that's.
But you haven't had one of those tests that the British Prime Minister says are readily available for everybody yet.
If those are readily available, I would have gone and got one as soon as I got off the plane, and I can assure you of that. But the announcement on the flight as it landed in London City Airport was, if you have symptoms, go home and self-isolate, and that's exactly what I did.
It is the mismatch between reality and the information and the declarations from governments. The only other thing that strikes me like this is when I've covered nuclear reporting in the past. So I'm adding virus and epidemics to nuclear power and nuclear weapons as items that seem to induce immediate lying on the part of governments and cover-ups. Wherever they go, nobody seems to be able to find it in them to tell the truth, that they hedge it around everywhere. And of course, the job of is to ferret that out. Thank you, you did well, Ruth. Have you had any, what type of support have you had from The Guardian now? Because the life of a foreign correspondent in these days of the gig economy, you're a stringer. So are you on sick pay, or are they looking after you?
So far, so good. Had lots of supportive messages from staff, including from the editor-in-chief. I'm in my house working, and just trying to get on with it, really. That's sort of the plan. So yeah, continuing to cover Egypt, continuing to keep on top of the news that's happening there, continuing to do stories. That's sort of the plan at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, The Guardian, for showing some respect for journalist rights in another sense. Courtney, have you found any other examples of have journalists been looked after by their newspapers, or have they washed their hands for 20 seconds or whatever of it?
So I think we really have seen an improvement in the media industry's awareness that this is ultimately a safety issue. In the wake of the murders of Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff in 2014 by ISIS in Syria, there was a widespread awakening that media organizations have a responsibility for the safety, not only of their staff, but also for freelancers and stringers who work for them. And we're now seeing that play out, I think, now. There's still a lot to be done, but we've seen that there is an increasing awareness about this issue. We have actually put out safety information for journalists that is being widely shared in the industry by news organizations as well as freelancers. And there are several funds that have been set up, emergency funds for journalists, on our website, cpj.org/COVID-19. We have a whole list of funds for journalists from that are supporting freelancers, that are supporting journalists who need support for their reporting, the Freelancers Union, the Frontline Freelance Register, a Culture of Safety Alliance. So, I am pleasantly surprised and heartened by the fact that many in the industry have taken into account that we have to create a culture of safety, including when that safety is a health issue. So we are seeing greater awareness of that. Of course, it's definitely not perfect. There is more to be done. There is a lack of personal protective equipment, PPE. It's really interesting because we've heard a lot about PPE for nurses and doctors on the front lines, and we've been talking about PPE for journalists, usually, reporting in conflict zones.
Pops aren't what they used to be.
Right. So, it's actually, I think, helpful. So when we talk about PPE for journalists now, this is including things like masks, but, some of the basic safety advice for journalists applies to people broadly, but also, media organizations realizing that they might need new equipment, they might need, better digital security. There are tons of webinars being offered about how to report on this issue and just on doing journalism safely during coronavirus, offered by many organizations, many that I just mentioned, the International Center for Journalists, many others. And all these resources that are being created, because you have to realize a lot of journalists now aren't able to go out and about. They're maybe reporting from behind their desk. They need to think more about digital security, about how to keep their communications confidential. Those that are going out into the field need to have the personal protective equipment. So there's still a lot to be done, but there is definitely more awareness than there was a few years ago about this issue.
One of the issues, of course, is that we've invoked the science. Whose science are we invoking? Is it Boris Johnson's advisor and herd immunity, or is it the CDC this week as compared with last week? And everything is so partisan now that I think that there'll be. We're in an era where I think there are probably councils around who are about to decide that pie is the value of pie is a democratic plot and it should be regulated. Rounded up to 4 because the president said so. We're in that degree of insanity in terms of the science. Is there any way to combat this between us all as journalists to find out, this is a definitive source that's unimpeachable, if you'll forgive the expression, under the circumstances?
I think journalists, I think we need to be realistic about what journalism is and what it is not, right? So journalism is about reporting what experts and others are saying and what they're seeing, what they're able to ferret out of, government data, et cetera. So I think it's important that, the public, when they are consuming journalism, realizes that it is not, journalism is not a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It is the first draft of history. It is often reporting on things, as I mentioned earlier, that authorities are saying, and hopefully, those authorities are credible. Obviously, you see a lot of reporting about what the WHO, the World Health Organization, says. But first of all, this is a novel virus, so our information about it is changing, new information coming to light. As it spreads, there might be new guidance. And journalists are not infallible, but it is something that is particular to journalism that makes it different from other forms of communication like propaganda or advertising, is when journalists get it wrong, they self-correct. That's why you have the corrections page. That's why you have this deep-seated fear by journalists of getting things wrong and making sure that they are fact-checking, double sourcing, et cetera, their information.
I'd just like to jump on the end of that point, which I really strongly agreed with, especially with the deep-seated sense of fear about getting things wrong, which I think all journalists live with that all of the time. And I think that fear is actually very helpful in a lot of ways because it keeps us in check. I think it's also about saying why you're citing a specific source, right? And so especially when it comes to citing scientific research, obviously, perhaps it's a little different with, the coronavirus, given, as you say, the novel nature of it, the fact that this is something new, and so there's new research coming out on it every time, and that is growing and changing just as our reporting is. But at the same time, I think it's also about saying, well, we're citing this piece of research right now for this reason. This gives us, at this point in time, the best picture of what we're trying to reach for, and also, hedging that with what the limitations of that research might be. That's also good journalistic practice. I find that having a conversation with the people who've conducted the research about the most responsible way to cite it is also a good idea. This is certainly my experience that when you read a piece of research, as a journalist, we might pick the most inflammatory part. And that's not necessarily, you know, if you're a scientist, actually the most relevant part. And that the people that have conducted it will push back on you and say, well, actually, the point is this. And, you know, it's worth having that conversation with people who conducted the research. It's worth reading the whole thing, and it's worth saying, you know, why we cite it. But if we can explain that to readers, that is something that I think they can pass and they will appreciate, especially in this time.
One of the most toxic elements of this clampdown is the fact that viruses don't need visas. Viruses swarm across frontiers regardless. They get on the plane without customs and immigration checks. And we're looking around, and when you hear the sound of silence from large parts of Africa, and you wonder what's happening in India, and you've been there and you've seen what the conditions are like, or you go to Mexico City, where people are packed together in tight proximity, and then you wonder what's happening there and what the effects are as that ricochets around the globe, because these viruses come back to haunt us. They may have started in America and gone to Mexico, they may have started in China and gone to India, but they'll come back to haunt all of us in the end, won't they?
I mean, I would say what you're pointing to there is the need for testing, right? Like when you go to a country and you see that their health service, or you speak to people there, and they say the health service here is lacking, that obviously lays the ground for a lack of testing. And testing is the only way that we know that the official figures being put out by governments have any relevance whatsoever. If the official rate, I mean, you know, you mentioned the UK, this is a problem in the UK too, right? Like
Especially in the UK.
Well, yes. You know, if the official rate is, you know, I don't know, if official rate is 100, but you've only tested 400 people or something, then, you know, I mean, I'm not saying that's obviously a, you know, completely farcical example, but there are places where that's not far off. So to go back to Egypt, at the time that they were getting angry about this piece of scientific research, in the same week, the WHO, the head of the WHO in Cairo said that Egypt, I think it was around the 17th, 18th of March, he said that Egypt had tested 3,015 people. And then a week later, the Minister for Health said that Egypt had tested 25,000 people. Egypt is a country of 100 million people. And yes, it's not a country with a huge economy. It's not a country with a particularly well-developed healthcare system. But it is now, according to the WHO, a country with a capacity for 200,000 tests. So the pressure is on Egypt to up the amount of people that it's testing, not just wait until they have systems, and not just wait until they have symptoms, and then you know, and then the official number will start to look more clear or believable in comparison to the number of tested people.
One of the old journalistic precepts as well is the cui bono, who's good. Why was young Mubarak Sprague so upset with you and the Guardian? I mean, what's his angle on it? Has he harnessed all of the test kits in Egypt and wants to ration them off?
I honestly, I think I would, if that was the case, then that would be great that we knew where the test kits were and that they could then be distributed to people. I think it's that the Guardian had published a piece back in 2011 that talked about some of Mubarak's billions being hidden overseas, and for some reason that seemed to resurface again recently because of Mubarak's death. I'm guessing if he saw it that Mubarak's children didn't particularly like the things that I wrote about Mubarak's funeral either, but maybe they didn't see those and they just saw the Guardian's reporting on Mubarak's money. But certainly there was that preconception that the Guardian has bad things to say about Egypt, even if sometimes, unfortunately, those bad things happen to be true. Or simply that the Guardian has consistently done a lot of reporting on Egypt, and the Mubarak family doesn't happen to like that very much either.
Well, our compliments to you for your part in that, whatever it is. Do we have any questions coming from out there? We can keep this going, but
We
We
do
have
have
out there. Jonathan, over to you.
well, you actually touched on Mexico City and other.
Yes, I did. I picked it up. I saw it as well.
Yes, I think we've answered that one. Then in here, we have a question from Simon that when Ruth was writing the story, did she reach out to the government at the time? If so, what was their response? And if not, can she share why she decided not to do this? What recommendations does she have for navigating official versus other sources?
Firstly, great question. Yes, I did reach out to the government. I did, unfortunately, what I do, or what I have done often when I am writing stories in Egypt, which is you ring the government official and you just listen to the phone ring and ring and ring. And then you try again and you listen to it ring, and then you write in the story that they were not available for comment, because unfortunately the spokesman for the Egyptian Ministry of Health is quite famous for not responding to journalistic queries in any way. So I cited the government multiple times. I cited the Prime Minister, I cited the Health Ministry, I cited the WHO. I believe I certainly cited them in follow-up reporting, and I got comment from the WHO in follow-up reporting. I even quoted the Egyptian Ministry of Health saying that my reporting was, I think they called it an insult to health. So I mentioned that in the follow-up reporting. So, the Egyptian government, there is a culture of fear that has permeated a lot of Egyptian officials. And that means that people, even if they're the designated spokespeople for a government agency, don't want to answer the phone to journalists, simply because they are a little afraid of being the person that speaks out, even if what they're speaking out about is something completely benign. And so my guidance on that is you still have to contact them for comment, even if people don't respond, and then you have to do what you can to go through places where maybe they have commented, any kinds of official statements, to make sure that those kinds of things are included, because obviously as journalists, it can create a certain sort of antipathy that they won't answer the phone to you, but you can't necessarily take that out on them in print. You still have to quote them.
There's another question coming from Frank Gomez from the Hispanic Foreign Policy Association. From your vantage point at the base of the pyramid there, what effect did the Egyptian government's denial have on their responses to the epidemic? Did it hinder it? Did it help it? Or could you actually track where their behavior made things worse or better?
I think that, across the world, having transparent discussion of where infection is happening enables public health. I think it's that the Egyptian government has this preconception that if their citizens have too much information, whether it's about coronavirus or whether it's about anything else, that this is going to be somehow a danger to society, that this will allow people to enact too many decisions on their own, even if that means protecting themselves from a virus. In terms of coronavirus, we've seen that the government in Egypt has taken measures to implement a lockdown, that they're currently deciding whether they've extended the lockdown, but they're trying to decide whether they would extend it to certain things, preventing people in lower wage jobs from going to work, for example. So the way that it's affected their reaction has generally been to focus on, place an enormous amount of emphasis on the official figures and say, this is all that you need to worry about. Just trust in the government. We've got this in hand. And then, a complete lack of transparency about things like testing, about things that actually would help people among the population protect themselves better from the coronavirus.
Well, we in the FPA immediately sent in a protest on your behalf. Did you get similar expressions of solidarity from others? I know the CPJ were in there right away, protesting what happened to you. Are you happy, as far as you can be happy, with expressions of sympathy and support from others?
Obviously, thank you, and genuinely, right? Like, this was not This was not anything that I wanted or anticipated would happen, but it is always good to be, you know, for colleagues to contact you and say, yeah, that you know, that sounds bad, we stand with you. And that's something that we have to extend to journalists that suffer this everywhere. You know, I mean, exactly as Courtney said, right, there are journalists suffering this in Iran, in Venezuela, journalists who were deported from China because the Chinese authorities took the opportunity to do that while everyone was distracted with coronavirus. And yeah, it's something that I'm very grateful for and just want to extend to other people.
We have another well-wisher here who wants to know what your plans are now. I don't know whether this entails a job offer. It's another journalist asking.
If they have a job offer for me, then they can, you know, they're welcome to contact me. No, I mean, at the moment, plans are keep reporting, and like everybody else, you know, nobody really knows what's happening at this point in time. So my only aim is just to keep reporting at the moment. It's as simple as that.
Ian, can I just jump in? Because I think it's I don't want to, I just wanted to touch on the point of the government's response and the support or non-support from the UK with a couple of points. One, I think it's heartening to know that at least the UK was there, and we are going to be pressuring the UK, Canada, and other governments that are involved in the Media Freedom Coalition, which is something that the UK launched last year to ostensibly support media freedom around the world. And we will be pushing for them to raise this issue beyond just the foreign policy establishment in Egypt, but to really put this front and center in their relationship with Egypt, and to, you know, put their money where their mouth is if they're going to talk about defending media freedom abroad. And I want to raise, you know, there was another case of a journalist, Declan Walsh, who worked for the New York Times, who had to, you know, leave Egypt quite suddenly as well to avoid arrest. And in that case, it appears that the US government may have known about it, and that somebody warned him going outside of official channels so that he would not get arrested. And that's deeply concerning, because the role that, you know, governments need to play during this coronavirus and the crackdowns, the repression that is accompanying it, along with the pervasive surveillance mechanisms that are being rolled out around the world, is really, really important. Because if we don't have these democracies and the leaders of these democracies standing up for the rights of journalists to report on what is happening, it will have an impact on their own national security, on their own health security. Because as you pointed out earlier, viruses don't know borders. And so actually, this is a global story where it behooves every government to support the right of journalists to report on what they are seeing on the ground, to act as a check on power, especially in countries where there is a lack of free flow of information and a lack of access to information, and a you know, stranglehold on official media, you know, by the authorities. And so, you know, I would like to see more robust defense from countries like the UK, like Canada, like US, Germany, others, for the importance of journalism during this coronavirus.
We have time for one more question, if anybody has one. Hello? Going?
Well, I might actually just
Jonathan, usurp your prerogatives. Go on.
As a question, it's how does it feel to have become the news? And, you know, I think probably this is not something that is, you know, something that you are not the first person to have done, the first reporter and journalist to have had this happen. But what lessons might you share with other journalists? And then also from the CPJ, I think the question becomes like, what are the resources that we can, you know, hold up and, you know, for journalists put in this situation? So if we could start with Ruth and then move to Courtney, please.
I realize this might sound a little bit disingenuous when I'm talking on something that's being broadcast and I'm talking to a group of people. I really do not like having become the news. I think that's probably a sentiment that is familiar to the other people in this conversation. None of us really wants to be in a situation where we're the story. And I don't tend to like writing stories where, you know, I'm even using the first person, and this is one of the rare instances where you say, okay, well, that is a necessary thing that I have to do to get to the topic of how journalists worldwide are being treated as a result of the crackdown on press freedom around reporting the coronavirus. In terms of helping journalists in this situation, I think that colleagues and I in Cairo previously, unfortunately, every time that something like this happens to one of your friends or your colleagues, you learn a little more about how the security services in Egypt or elsewhere are treating journalists at this time. And unfortunately, we can take some lessons from that to be better prepared for the future, put resources together to say, okay, do you have a security, you know, as an individual, do you have a security plan in place? Who is your point person if you get arrested while out reporting? Drop a pin to where you've been reported so that we know what police station you're in. Things like this, to have that discussion with colleagues, to make those resources available, unfortunately, to journalists who visit places like Egypt. That is immensely important. I have spent a lot of time speaking to people who are coming into Egypt to do reporting, not just because obviously I am a selfless public servant, and that, you know, that is, but because it matters, because it, you know, you don't want colleagues to show up and to be unprepared, and it's just, that's so important for safety, and it's important that journalists talk to each other about the security requirements of reporting in a place like Egypt. And it's also important that we share these resources with news organizations and with CPJ and with places like ACOS.
We've got one final, we said it was the final one, but Peter Hall has been, he was following this epidemic 10 years before the epidemic actually happened. He wrote books presaging it. So I feel he ought to come in here. And he mentions the great flu epidemic of 1918. Which had nothing to do with Spain at all, but became the Spanish flu. And I noticed yesterday morning in the Wall Street Journal, there was an op-ed describing it as the Wuhan virus again. There's a point about journalists, there are some responsibilities here not to feed on popular, to at least set the record straight that those viruses that came in 1918 were not carrying Spanish passports and didn't lisp. And the ones that this virus doesn't have chopsticks and come from Wuhan and flying on the wings of bats either. I mean, do you think the journalists have a responsibility here, or is it okay to report that this using these terms?
No, I mean, there's no way that any responsible journalist should be calling it the Wuhan virus. Our job is to hold governments to account. That's
the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, so you judge whether it's responsible or not.
No comment, but I would just say that, you know, reporting racist language is not part of journalism. It doesn't serve a public purpose. Journalists are here for a public purpose. That's it.
Do you want to chip in a dime on this?
Not on this, but I think on the issue of journalists becoming the story. I mean, obviously, the Committee to Protect Journalists is basically a news service covering attacks on the press. So all of our stories are about journalists.
Yes.
But you know, one of the things that we think is very important is to make sure that we are reporting on what journalists are facing and what it's like doing journalism during this time. We have launched a series of Q&As with journalists around the world in many different countries and in the United States about what this means for their job, what they're dealing with from a safety perspective, what if any sort of threats or oppression they're facing, or how they're dealing with that. And I see that, you know, one of the questions in the chat was about, you know, what type of repression we might see in the US, UK, or I guess other democracies. And I think we're really concerned about restrictions on access to information. We've seen the FBI, for example, reported that they're going to limit public records requests during the pandemic. We've seen restrictions on access to press conferences, officials trying to figure out how do they maintain access and engagement with the press when you can't do that in person. What does that look like? Of course, the vilification issue is a huge one, and something that we didn't talk about, but which we are definitely concerned about, is the surveillance mechanisms and processes that are being rolled out around the world. Some that, where governments have direct access to telecommunications data, seem to lack the safeguards and limitations that they need in order to make sure that they aren't then used in a nefarious way, which we know that there is precedence for. Because if we recall September 11th, the war on terror, all of the new terrorism legislation that passed in the UK, US, and elsewhere, gave all of these these big powers to governments that were then very difficult to draw back and led to massive surveillance. We know that journalists were targeted in that. So we need to be, I think, very proactive in ensuring that while the authorities get the powers that they need to address the very real health crisis, that those powers are limited, they have some sort of sunset clause, that there are restrictions and safeguards on how that data is used, because we should be protecting human rights, protecting press freedom, protecting the ability of journalists to do their jobs, which includes reporting on public authorities, accessing information, and communicating with sources confidentially. So we need to protect those rights even as we seek to combat the coronavirus.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. I'd like to really thank Ruth and salute you for your indefatigable courage in standing up to the Macabarettes. They're not nice people in Egypt, I know. Thank you, Courtney, for putting it in perspective. And I'd like to remind you that our series continues. Tomorrow, we actually have some of the first victims of viral warfare. We have the Chairman Cedric Cromwell of one of the Indian nations, who is describing how this administration has been using cover of the virus to do a land grab. It follows on an old tradition of putting smallpox-infected blankets. They're using the cover of the virus this time to blanket a land grab on the Indian nations, is what he's claiming. We'll be having some cultural pursuits. Next week, we have discussions with the woman who was very much in charge of making sure that Taiwan stayed virus-free, which is a story that wasn't told nearly as much as it should be. So we are continuing this. We welcome your patronage. We're very grateful to have you here and your questions and your insights. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again soon. Tomorrow, I hope. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this broadcast. To learn more about our digital forums and programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. For membership information, please visit www.foreignpressassociation.org and on Twitter at FPA New York. This has been an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.